Wanted to welcome you to our Celtx Industry Series webinar today. Today we're doing narrative design, building interactive worlds with Nick Jones. Nick is joining us, as I said earlier, from New Zealand. So we're really happy to have him here early in the morning, his time. Appreciate that. And we're just going to get started. So who are we? If you've attended any of our webinars before, you probably recognize myself. I am Dara. I'm going to be your host today. Joining me today is a new member of our webinar team, Junior. If you've been in one of our webinars before, you would have seen Junior probably helping out in chat or Q&A. Today, he's going to be taking care of the community questions. So you'll be hearing from him very shortly. And then on our panel of helpers, we have Marcel. If you just want to wave hi there, Marcel. So Marcel is going to be working in the chat, answering some of your questions there. We have Chelsea, who is going to be helping in the chat as well. And then we have Nicole, who you've probably seen before if you've been to a webinar before, and she's going to be helping with the questions and answers. And then, of course, our feature, Nick, is going to be answering your questions. We've been working with Nick here at Celtx for about 3 years now, I'd say, Nick, that between...
Yeah, that sounds about right, I think.
Yeah. So Nick was the first one I thought of when we decided we wanted to do a webinar on narrative design, because he's both worked in the field and taught in the field. So he's a real expert, in my opinion. So before we get started, I did want to let you know, as I said, we've been working with Nick for some time now. Nick is very used to our GameVR project here at Celtx. This is a project that's available to you during your trial. And if you are a subscribed user, then depending upon your subscription, you might have it available to you as a full featured project or just a sample version of it, basically. But what the GameVR project includes is a script with an attached story map that lets you plan out your narrative on a story map and then script it similar to how you would script a film script. Along with that, you get a playthrough option that lets you sort of play through the script and track where all of your choices lead. You get a range of story map options, so you can do transitions, jump nodes, interactive dialogue to sort of drive your character through the map. And for professional users, we also have conditions and variables. So for things like must have this key to enter through that door kind of thing. And then, of course, we have asset management, as we do in all of our projects. So that is all I wanted to say there. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing that screen. And bear with me for 1 second. My computer's being a little finicky. There we go. Okay, so Nick, I just wanted to touch base with you before we get started with all of our questions and just ask about your background. So basically, how you've worked on several games, you've taught narrative design. Can you tell us how you get started in this field and a little about the work you've done?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Dara. Yeah, I guess getting started in any sort of creative field, from discussions I've had with other creatives, there is always a degree of luck involved, and sort of just sort of being in the right place at the right time, and that was definitely the case for me, which I will jump into in a second. But I do think it is also important to have knowledge and training around these sorts of creative subjects that can really sort of bolster your ability to get into the industry or whatever creative industry you're wanting to get into, right? But I guess for me, geez, where did it start? I mean, I've been a writer my entire life. I was raised by a father who's a published poet, and so sort of was around that my whole life. I think I wrote my first story when I was about 4 or 5 years old. And so, like, I've always sort of been a storyteller, but I guess I lost that along the way for quite a period of time, particularly through teenage years, early 20s sort of thing. I was raised in a fairly religious family, so to sort of keep the parents happy, I went to Bible college and did all that for a while, and was actually I think a year or two into being a youth pastor at a local
Wow.
church, before I really sort of started reevaluating what I was doing with my life and sort of where I was going. Part of this was, I have no problem sort of saying it, but I'm gay, and so part of the issues sort of came into play because of that, and because of sort of wanting to be my true self and everything. And so I ended up leaving being a youth pastor, leaving church basically entirely, and then sort of was in this period of my life where I was kind of lost and didn't really know what I was doing, and so I was sort of grabbing at straws, trying to figure out what I wanted to do, and eventually I sort of just came down to what have I always wanted to do in my life, and what would I do if I didn't even get paid for it? What was my passion? And that was really storytelling. And so I decided I was going to go to university and study creative writing and become a novelist, and maybe an English teacher in the meantime, while I became the next Stephen King or whoever. So I went to uni to study creative writing. But as I sort of went through my undergrad, I realized more and more that my writing was focusing around games. So I was doing a lot of analysis of game narrative, and that sort of field, I guess. And I'd always been a gamer growing up. PlayStation 1, PlayStation 2, all those consoles. So it was always a big part of my life as well. And I think around near the end of my final year of my undergrad, I started thinking, well, what would it be like to write for games? Excuse me. And so I started possibly a bit naively emailing people that were in, I guess, game parallel industries, things like local video game review websites and things like that, to ask them how do I get involved? Like who do I speak to? What do I need to do? And most of these websites, understandably, we have no idea. That's not our area at all. But I did happen to come across one person at one of these websites who pointed me in the direction of possibly our most senior narrative designer, shall I say, in New Zealand, a guy called Edwin McRae. And Edwin was the initial narrative designer for the game Path of Exile, which I had not heard of at all at that point. And so I started sort of chatting with him, and we hit it off. And eventually he offered me I guess like a internship working underneath him. So I came on board with Path of Exile as a junior writer, I guess you would call it, and sort of learned everything that I now know from him. And then eventually he decided he wanted to move on and do something else. So I ended up taking over within the same year. So I went from having never written for a game before to essentially being the one in charge of the narrative for a game that had at the time upwards of 10 million registered users. I think by the time I left, it was about 20 million. I'm not sure what it is now, but yeah. So I worked for them for I think 2.5 years, and sort of had to, it was kind of like a proverbial trial by fire, and then from there, you sort of work on. This is where I guess where the luck comes into it. You sort of work on one big project, and then people sort of know you from that and start approaching you about other things. And so I guess that's my story, how I got into it. I branched out a few years ago into teaching narrative design. I've always been an academic and a researcher, and my university loves me because I was top of the class with a lot of the papers that I did. So they were more than happy to sort of help me set up this paper that we did for 2 years. Unfortunately, it was closed down this year due to COVID-19 budget sort of restraints and everything. But yeah, for 2 years we were teaching a paper on interactive narrative media, and sort of looked at the history of interactive narrative, going all the way back to bizarrely enough, sort of occult texts and fortune telling, divination texts, because they really are like the earliest form of a narrative that you interact with and get your own personal meaning out of. So we sort of look at that and then move into how does this work in the industry today, and then step by step, these are the different processes that you undertake as a narrative designer, so that our students are as schooled up as possible for entering the industry.
That's great. I can't imagine. It's kind of like deciding you want to be a script writer and your very first job is on a feature film, you know, like you just went straight into Path of Exile. I mean, that's amazing. And I know, like, I've had some interactions with your students when you've been using Celtx in your course, and yeah, I feel like you've really given them a lot of background. They always come across as very knowledgeable whenever they contacted me. So I always felt like you were really giving them everything they needed to know to enter the industry really well.
That's good to hear. I didn't know that.
Yeah, no, they're you know, we work with a lot of schools here, and you can always tell who the really great teachers are by the way that their students interact with us when they come in with questions, kind of thing, you know, like the knowledge that they show and things like that. It always kind of shows through. So definitely. On that note, so when you have your students and they're starting up in the class and they're deciding to take that class, how do you describe narrative design and how it applies to creative efforts? And I know you've talked about other forms of writing, and you talked about the earlier forms of narrative design that you teach in your course. So do you feel that those narrative design skills are useful outside of game writing as well? I guess that's a two-part question. So let me know if you need any part of it repeated.
So I'll answer the first part first.
Yeah.
So I look, narrative design's a fairly new industry. You know, game writing's been around for, you know, the last 20, wow, 30 years, sort of thing. But narrative design as an individual profession, as far as I'm aware, has only been around maybe 10 or so years at best. So as a result, there's still a lot of shall we say, differing opinions within narrative designers as to what narrative design actually is. Is it the same as game writing? Is it separate to game writing? Is it a mix of both? These are sort of questions that people have been asking for as long as I've been working in narrative design, which I believe is coming up on 5 years, 5.5 years soon. But the way I sort of see it is in one way a sort of combination of a bunch of different writing techniques across media. Particularly, there's a heavy influence from film, obviously, things like dramatic storytelling. But what differentiates narrative design from game writing or from novel writing or script writing, screenwriting, is that narrative design is about interactivity and what I would call emotional or dramatic truth sort of working together in tandem. So you can have a game with a story, but that is not necessarily a game that has had narrative design applied to it, right? Story is plot and sequence of events, characters, but narrative design looks at it basically looks at what are the core gameplay loops going on in this game, and how can the themes of the story of the narrative be reflected in those loops, and then how can we reflect the loops in the narrative. So it's kind of this marriage between the two. Often what you get is a game that doesn't sort of take into account narrative design will often be called, one of the buzzwords, ludonarrative dissonance, which is where the themes of the story are in contrast to the themes of the game. We look at something like one of the new Wolfenstein reboots, for example. Great game, but it does thematically in the story deal with the idea of how destructive war is and how it has like this negative effect on people's mental health and things like that. Meanwhile, the gameplay is encouraging you to kill Nazis in the most brutal fashion possible, right? And look, I'm all for killing Nazis, but in terms of the marrying between the themes and the gameplay, there's a bit of a disconnect there. So what narrative design is after is ludonarrative cohesion, essentially. And so that's where the focus of my work is when I come on board with the game is how do we make sure that these two elements work together in a fluid way. So that's how I would describe narrative design. Do I use narrative design in any other application? Absolutely. Narrative design, I think, is much bigger than just something that you use within the games industry. Personally, I've worked as a narrative designer on several projects outside of the games industry. You see a lot of it in sort of big businesses. Often will involve a narrative designer to come on board and help them with their sort of I don't like the term, but like corporate narrative and that side of things. You see narrative design in again, not a fan of the term, but like educational games, which I think we might get to a little bit later. But I've worked for the Auckland Hospital on a sort of application that had a narrative to sort of help with teenagers with mental health issues. Recently, I can't speak too much about it just yet, but for the past year, my partner and I have been setting up a small perfume business. This is one of our interests outside of games, and one of the things that we've been doing with that is involving narrative design into that and building a story world for our products, so that when customers are purchasing products or interacting with our presence on social media and stuff, they're actually interacting with a story world and solving mysteries and uncovering lore, for lack of a better word, about the world that we're creating. So there are many different applications, I guess, for narrative design across multiple different projects.
Oh, that's really interesting. You said some things I wasn't expecting there, which totally makes sense, in terms of like the marketing world and building the corporate lore and all of that. But it wasn't really where my head was going when I was thinking about other places you can apply narrative design. So it's really great to hear that. And I think like we can see it, just as an aside, we ordered coffee because it's very early for Nick in New Zealand. We ordered coffee through his house, and I was checking out New Zealand coffee roasteries, and you can see it in some of them that they've used some kind of, and maybe it hasn't been a full narrative design, but they're creating corporate stories, and each coffee has its own story and the way they loop together and tie together. And tie into their other products. You can actively see it on their website. So it's interesting to recognize that as narrative design, I guess, is I think in my head it was like, well, this is their marketing story, but it makes sense that you would use narrative design for that. Totally. So we'll go back to games, although I'd love to hear more about your perfume business, but we'll go back to games. So when it comes to creating games, you talked about, the themes of the game and the gameplay and the game's story and how they need to connect basically and represent the same things. So where does narrative design fall in that process? Is it something that you start at the very beginning with? Does it come in after, partway through the process? Or is it something that just is always there? You have to start, begin, middle, and end with it, kind of thing?
So I'll give you two answers
Okay.
for that. In an ideal world, I would say that narrative design begins with the conception of the idea and carries on all the way to probably the latter stages of the game development. I don't think it necessarily needs to continue all the way to release date per se, though it probably is helpful to keep a narrative designer on the payroll until that point, just in case there are last minute fixes that need to be done. But yeah, in an ideal world, such as, for example, you said you wanted to hear more about the perfume business. Yeah. With that, because I'm the founder of it, we are including narrative design right from the get-go. And what that means is that there is cohesion to the stories that we're telling. We eliminate or greatly minimize the risk of contradictions and things like that within the project. And so in gaming, that is particularly important because game narrative design is oftentimes more about building a world than it is about building a plot or a story. And so it's very important that you have a grasp of everything as you are moving through the process, because things can change. And if things change and you're not aware of how things exist currently in the story world, then you can end up with some pretty glaring errors or contradictions. Now, how it actually works in the industry, in my experience, and keep in mind, being in New Zealand, it is harder for me to work with the bigger studios. AAA studios often require you to move to wherever they're based. And there have been a few near moments when I have done that, but with the current global situation, that has kind of made it impossible for any of those to follow through. So I have only I've worked primarily within the game industry with small indie studios, even like one or two developers, and then sometimes sort of upper level indie studios as well, what I believe are called AA games. So that's where my perspective is coming from. And in these cases, I will be brought on at different stages of the project. Sometimes, very rarely, it will be early on, like very early on. But most of the time, I get brought on once the rough game has already been developed, the gameplay loops are already in play, and so then it becomes a process of working out what they have already for the narrative and what they have in terms of gameplay, and then sort of figuring out, okay, how can we strengthen this by bringing these two things together?
That makes sense. Yeah, I've been working recently with my 12-year-old who wants to develop a tabletop, like card-based game, kind of a role-playing game, and it's a real chore sometimes trying to remind them, okay, I know what you want to do. I know the actions you want players to take, but we need to think about why we're making them take those actions and what the story is, so it's keep having to draw it back to, let's develop the characters. Let's, figure this out. And of course they just want
to. Especially in tabletop gaming. I'm actually working on a tabletop RPG at the moment as part of my PhD research. And it's very important to sort of have those things working together from the get-go, in my opinion, because otherwise you can end up with a game that's a little too crunchy on the rules, or it could be a little too floaty and airy-fairy and only story based, and you want to sort of strike a medium between those two.
Yeah. Definitely. Sounds like when you go into a company, you're like me with my 12-year-old now. Hold on, move back. We have to think about the story. No, it's I guess like in an ideal world, definitely, you would be part of the whole process from the beginning until close to release, if not release. But I understand, obviously, budgetary reasons and things like
Yeah,
that.
of course. And you can't blame anyone for that.
No,
Games are expensive to make.
exactly.
So you've got to, especially as someone working in a fledgling industry within the games industry, I have to be willing to sort of be fluid with when I get it brought on, and unfortunately how much I charge and things like that. You always have to sort of keep that in mind, and sort of gauge, okay, where is this development team at in terms of funding and what they can afford, because for me, writing for games is a passion. So like if it means that I have to take a little bit of a hit to help a project that I think could be really cool, stand on its own two legs, then that's something that I would definitely consider.
Right. Yeah, that's lovely. And I think that's from your creative side. I find a lot of creatives have to kind of make those choices. I really love this project. I really want to do this project. I'm not sure if I can afford to eat if I do this project, but what have I got to lose, really? So yeah, definitely. Earlier, you mentioned Wolfenstein and how you felt that it could have used a little more narrative design, to put it mildly. On the flip side of that, what games or other media do you feel that gets narrative design right, and why do you feel that?
Right. Yeah. And to be clear, Wolfenstein is a great game.
It's a great game.
Not bagging on Wolfenstein. I really enjoyed those games, but I'm not playing them for the story as much
it's
as
for
I'm
killing people.
And look, I don't know if I would necessarily say that there is a game out there that has perfectly brought narrative design into their project. I think we've got different games that have varying degrees of success with narrative design, and games that exhibit different aspects of narrative design in a really well thought out way. What comes to mind for me immediately, something like Dark Souls or Bloodborne, which on the face of it might seem quite sparse when it comes to plot or narrative. There's actually, there's a lot of world building going on behind the scenes with those games. If anyone in the audience is a fan, they'll know exactly what I'm talking about here. You jump on the Reddit forums and there are screeds of pages of people discussing like, what does this mean, and is this the history of the world? And so Bloodborne and Dark Souls, they are really good examples of another buzzword, environmental storytelling, right? They show the state of the world that you are existing in through the physical environment and landscape of the game, through placement of items and enemies. Everything is put where it is for a narrative reason. And so those games are really fascinating as a narrative designer to sort of unpack and explore. Outside of that, The Witcher 3, Wild Hunt is a really good example of world building as well, and also character writing. They have really strong, well-written characters, and this is partly because it comes from a book series originally, but the writers on that game really did a good job. We think, okay, so I have been in trouble in the past for critiquing Life is Strange, because I feel like the ending of that game was a bit all over the place in terms of its narrative design. But Life is Strange 2 really does a good job of that. And what I mean when I talk about the endings there, Life is Strange, without giving away any spoilers, Life is Strange 1 presents you with a choice at the end of the game that essentially, it's not a good choice to have to make. It's a choice between saving a bunch of people or saving one person that you have a connection to, right? And I may have given away too many spoilers there, but if you're working in narrative design, I hate to break it to you, spoilers are a thing. And
Absolutely.
so the issue that I have with that game is that the game has been building up as a coming of age story for the past, however many hours you've been playing it. And it's all been sort of thematically moving towards this idea that sometimes the right decision is the hardest one to make. And then it presents you with an option to make the wrong decision. And if you choose the wrong decision, the ending just feels very, I don't know if last minute is the right word, but there is an obvious right ending and an obvious secondary ending that was tacked on. And I don't claim to know what went on behind the scenes there, but purely from a narrative perspective, this results in a situation where if the player chooses the wrong option, then they get a badly constructed ending, in my opinion. Whereas Life is Strange 2, they present you with a similar choice at the end of that. And I believe there are a few different endings in that one. And I played through a couple of them and, YouTube the others. And they all sort of exist as, they feel like true endings, regardless of which one you choose. And that's what's very important with choice-based storytelling, is that every ending feels like it is the ending, rather than the tacked on ending. So that's some good examples with games. Outside of games, I am limited again by being in New Zealand, but there are some good immersive theatre experiences in the States. I'm sure you guys had some as well. Things like Meow Wolf or Sleep No More. They use some pretty solid narrative design from what I understand in their experiences. So yeah, that's a few for you.
Yeah, definitely. I suspect that places like Disney World probably have narrative designers on staff for some of their kind of immersive experiences too.
Quite a good friend of mine was brought on board with Disney to help them sort of compete with the Harry Potter theme park.
Right. Yeah.
Back. So yes.
Yeah, definitely. I think I was fortunate enough to take my children, well, fortunate enough, if we want to say it that way, to take my children there a couple of years ago, and you could see a big difference between their more recent attractions and the older ones, where the more recent ones were really, it was a world building experience. You went into this whole theme and everything was just designed to make you feel a certain way, which is Disney itself, of course, as well, but you could see it reflected in the rides. So it's in a lot of places. Narrative design is like a lot of places you wouldn't necessarily consider, for sure. On that note, earlier you did mention, a hospital using you to help with a program for teenagers with mental health struggles. What role do you see narrative design playing in the future, but I guess in our society? So can we use it to address social issues, to learn new skills, and to kind of develop our humanity, I guess is the best way to say that.
Look, so I believe good storytelling can change the world. If I didn't believe that, I wouldn't be doing this. I think stories really are the primary weapon we have against these sort of darker parts of humanity. And I believe that as a society, we're sort of moving into the sort of age of experience or age of interactivity. It's not enough to just sort of sit docilely in front of a screen and watch a movie anymore. Younger audiences are looking for more interactive pieces of media to consume. You see how massive something like TikTok is with Gen Zs so there is this sort of shift, I believe, towards participation and sort of interactive engagement with text. But I also think it's important that like as we're exploring this sort of field, that we are being careful not to sort of introduce tribalism into our audiences. And this is particularly relevant when we look at the sort of narrative design models that are being used in media today. Primarily, we have the hero's journey narrative model, and I'm sure a lot of the audience has heard of that. Now, the hero's journey is something believed by me and a few others to be a little bit overused, and a model that is based on violence, essentially, as its core component. It is a hero versus a villain, and the sort of the world suffers because of this sort of exchange between these two sort of characters or archetypes. There is a new sort of a newer narrative model that has been observed by myself and a few others, in particular. I don't know if you guys know of him, but Jeff Gomez, who is the CEO of a company called Starlight Runner Entertainment in New York, and they're brought on board to essentially do the narrative design for large story worlds. So they worked on the Disney theme parks, for example. They worked on Pirates of the Caribbean, Halo, Spider-Man, all these sorts of big Hollywood properties. And this model that Jeff observed first, actually, is what we sort of term the collective journey narrative model. And the collective journey narrative model is kind of a response to the hero's journey and a critique of it. And a collective journey doesn't focus on a singular hero. It focuses on a collective of characters as they sort of struggle and fight and team up and gradually come to realize that the villain that they're facing in the story world is the system that they are living under. So the system is broken, and the only way to sort of fix that system is by coming together as a collective and working together with each other's strengths and weaknesses to create long-standing societal change, right? Now, this is a model that has particularly practical uses when it comes to the real world. Jeff has worked with his team in, say, Colombia, for example, when FARC was in control quite heavily, and they worked in a district in Colombia where they introduced the collective journey narrative model as kind of like a social activation outreach program to encourage lawfulness, and they saw a drop in crime there as a result. But that being said, this model and other models, they can also be used for I don't like to say the word evil, but for bad things, and particularly how Jeff first came across the collective journey was by observing Vladimir Putin in Russia. And look, I'm not an expert in Russian politics, but the way I understand it is back in the 90s, Putin was sort of struggling to keep a hold of power and sort of trying to figure out how he was going to do this. And one of his top guys, a man named Vladislav Surkov, I believe his name was, he visited an art exhibit in France that used non-linear narrative storytelling and sort of multilateral narrative in it, which essentially translates to flashing lights, confusion, noises, all sorts of things happening all around you. And by the end of it, you're kind of docile and can sort of be led out of the exhibit, right? And so he thought, what if we use this in politics? So he took this narrative model back to Putin and said to him, I want you to release a statement this morning about this particular thing and be really, really against it. And then I want you to release another statement this evening being really, really for it. And so the Russian government started putting out these statements that were contradictory all the time. And of course, at first, the people looked at this and went, these guys are idiots. They don't know what they're doing. stupid, they're crazy, and everyone laughed at them for a while. But they kept doing this for a period of several years, and the public went from thinking these guys are stupid to siding with different viewpoints and creating their own little insular tribes and fighting with each other. And then they just got confused, and then they just got exhausted to the point where everyone just thought, look, we don't know what the hell is going on, but we know Putin sits above it all. He's our strong man. He'll get us through it if there's an issue. And so they used this multilateral narrative, information jamming sort of stuff to control the Russian people and establish Putin's reign. And a lot of this is stuff that you see in, I guess, a negative use of the collective journey narrative model. Now, did Donald Trump do the same thing in America? I won't say. I have my own opinions of that, but and if he did it, I don't know whether he did it on purpose, but these are the sorts of negative applications that narrative design can have on the world. So look, I would say if you're going to use narrative design outside of gaming or even inside gaming as well, please use it for good. Please use it for progress and
Yes.
social change rather than cementing these sort of archaic destructive ideals on other people. So yeah, does that answer the question?
It absolutely does. That was a great answer, actually. The whole time you were talking, my brain was going, propaganda. And then you started talking about Putin and, oh, okay, yeah, that's true. No, that's a great answer to the question. And actually, I'm going to hand you off to Junior now for some of our participant submitted questions. And I think you've probably answered a couple of those already, but Junior, I'll be sure to kind of lob them to you in a correct order. And I'll hand it over now. Junior, you're just on mute, so unmute yourself.
Thank you, Dara. Yeah, all right. So Nick, we'll just jump right back into it.
Sure.
You know, I guess sort of just speaking to your previous points there, we have a question. How can we explore building longer narratives in an interesting way without resorting to the classic 3-act and hero's journey formats? You know, kind of based on what you're saying, like, you know, when you build, well, I'll let you speak to it.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, look, there is a place for hero's journey narrative models, right? And 3-act narratives. The reason why those narratives are so prevalent and have withstood the test of time is because they are embedded in us, in our like primal self, right? You know, back way back when we were all cavemen hiding in trees or in caves, we were telling each other stories around the fire, and these stories existed to instruct others how to survive in a harsh world where anything could kill you and eat you at any moment. And you know, this is where the sort of that tribalism thing comes from that I talked about earlier with the hero's journey is, you know, your tribe had to be the right tribe because there were different tribes, and if you were the wrong tribe, you were dead, right? And so that's where the hero's journey comes from. If you go back far enough, it's about raising up warriors to go away from their tribe, bring back food, slaves, unfortunately, and all sorts of resources to your community. And you see the structure in the hero's journey. Yeah, so that is all based in this sort of tribalism and violence. And so I would encourage writers, if they are wanting to explore outside of 3 acts or hero's journey stuff, to definitely look at collective journey. There's plenty of stuff online about it at this point from Jeff and others as well, actually. But then there are also other narrative models, and these narrative models are unfamiliar to those of us from a Western audience a lot of the times. Different cultures have different ways of constructing narratives. You look at Japanese narratives, they often tend to be more I guess, character driven and thematically driven rather than plot driven. There's often like if you've read any like Miyazaki or any Japanese authors, and you haven't read Japanese works before, it can often feel a little bit strange as to why it seems like the plot isn't taking big action movements constantly. You look at Scandinavian narrative structure, which sort of centers around a central hub that characters go out from, do the little bits and pieces, their little adventures, and then they come back and unpack to each other what has happened before going out again. So there are various different structures that come from different cultures, and then there are structures that I guess have been developed by people like myself and Jeff and others to explore different ways of telling stories.
Yeah. So I guess like when you're writing for characters, for example, like say a character is uninterested in talking about themselves, how can a writer share their thoughts and values with the audience? And I guess to that point, like how do you, I guess, sort of reconcile, for lack of a better word, how do you sort of juggle those different voices?
Yeah, I mean it's not a simple answer. I don't think there's a one size fits all for this. But I think I guess like gaming in general, if I were to point to a particular thing that gaming struggles with when it comes to narrative and storytelling, it's to do with pacing. And in particular, this is connected to, I guess, like the subtleties of emotions that characters can display. And this is, partly a technology issue, right? As games get better, we get better graphics and are able to show more subtle facial features and emotions better. But often the fix for this at the moment is like an info dump from the developers, whether it's in-game text or something else. That tends to be the sort of workaround at the moment. But look, I think in terms of finding ways to express things about characters that are, that the character might not necessarily want to show. We can take tools and tips from, for example, the film industry, screenwriting, right? And this idea of show, don't tell, looking at events or moments in the game that can be representative of sort of larger emotional subtext that the character might be feeling. That's probably how I would go about it. But all of these are kind of band-aid fixes until we have technology that can really sort of show the intricacies of human nature and of the emotions that we experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just yesterday I saw a screenshot of Horizon Zero Dawn on PlayStation 4 side by side with a shot of the upcoming game. And I think we're kind of at this point of getting diminishing returns on like our jumping graphics kind of thing, but like you can still see the difference, like the emotion expressed in the character's eyes, for example, like really, like I think we're getting to that point.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if we see in the next few years the focus on graphics sort of becoming more focused and looking particularly at subtleties and facial features and body language, as opposed to trying to make everything photorealistic.
Absolutely. And so what are some tactics to, I guess, reinforce the character's worldview without the world reflected necessarily within the character?
Can you repeat that one for me?
Yeah, sorry. What are some tactics to reinforce a character's worldview without necessarily the world being reflected on the character?
It's an interesting question. I'm not sure if I'm understanding it fully, but again, I would probably point to looking at ways to represent things in events and things around the character as a way to sort of point to the internal machinations of that character. See if I can think of an example. So I wrote a screenplay a few years back that dealt with a protagonist who had been essentially in a car accident and that had resulted in the death of their child and of one of their children actually. And so the sort of journey that this character was going on was to do with the guilt that they felt for this happening, and I got to the point at the end where I needed to find a way to represent not change in the character, but like kind of the hint of change, that things might change in the future, and the way that I ended up doing that was looking at the relationship between that character and his other child, his eldest, his daughter, and sort of the building of that relationship. And so that character, the daughter, kind of became a like a second chance, I guess, for the character, right? And in the end, the only way to sort of accurately convey that that suggestion of change was to put the characters in a position where the protagonist had to save his daughter the way that he failed to save his son, and so you've got this sort of mirror image being reflected between the start of the film and the end of the film, and that, you know, by saving her in that way is suggestive of change occurring in the character. So I would probably look at similar sort of setups to represent shifts in characters' internal logic and monologue and things like that. Does that answer the question? I hope I didn't veer off too much with that.
I don't know if it necessarily answers that question, but it's probably a better answer. we could have I think that speaks to you know, how events in the world influence the characters, certainly, and vice versa. So I guess we'll move back into the game sort of side of things. How do you go? We have a question here that asks, how do you go about implementing, you know, a choose your story option, or in general, having the user's choices affect the story while still keeping a consistent narrative?
Okay. Yeah. Choice is obviously very important for interactive storytelling, but choice can get unwieldy very, very fast, particularly if decisions being made by the player have large external effects on the world around them, right? You know, you give the player a choice to either kill off an important character or leave them alive, then you've got to write two versions of the story, right? One where they're alive and one where they're dead. And so I think the more effective way of going about this is a subtler way, and that is creating choices that influence character relationships in terms of tone. So you might have a choice to react to a character in a kind, empathetic way, or react to them in an arrogant way, right? And that choice can change the tone of an entire conversation that the player might have with a character, and allow the player to interpret the events in a different light. So I think that's a good way to go about it. but choices also need to feel effective to be immersive, right? So we don't want to create choices that don't have any effect on the plot or on character relationships. We want every decision to count. And I think there are different kinds of choices as well that you can use, right? I personally think there's a lot of confusion around the kinds of choices that are used in games. You get the term moral choice floated around a lot. And moral choice, in my opinion, is often more a resource management choice. You say you're playing, I don't know, a zombie shooter game, right? And the game will present you with a choice of, do you want to save this person or steal their gun, right? And so then it becomes like on the surface, maybe a moral choice, but really it's a resource choice, because you're thinking, do I want the extra bullets to keep me safe, or do I want to like see where this takes me? And so that's one example of choice. There is, as I mentioned before, illusory choices. So these are choices that really have no effect on the progress of the game's plot. They're more just in there to I guess keep the player attentive and make them feel like they're engaging. And they're the ones that I would personally avoid. And then you have true moral choices, which to me are choices that have no clearly defined good or bad decision to it. That both decisions are kind of like a bit of both. They're kind of morally ambiguous. It's typically a choice between getting something good in the short term, but something bad in the long term. And I would also say that a true moral choice should not have like a timer on it. As soon as you put a timer on a choice, it becomes a resource management sort of thing again, because you have to like make the decision fast. And so you're going to make a decision that works best for like your strategy as you're moving through the game, as opposed to considering what are the narrative results or relational results between me and the other characters.
Perfect. Okay. Yeah, we have one question here. How do we tackle concerns around assumptions about the user? I think this kind of speaks to a point you were talking about earlier. About how Japanese media can seem a little strange if you haven't experienced it before. So, this person says, I wouldn't necessarily like to assume a Western audience, but for instance, most interactive work tends to assume left to right direction with the index. I assume they mean like in terms of localization, reading right or left to right. Mm-hmm. So yeah, how do you tackle concerns or assumptions about the user in general?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, this is sort of veering a little bit outside of what I do in my job. At the end of the day, it's the creative directors and the game developers that make these sorts of decisions around localization and things like that. The best that I can do is provide a story that that doesn't assume things about the audience, right? And so again, to mention Jeff Gomez and Collective Journey again, that narrative model is all about multiple perspectives and the crossing of paths between characters with different perspectives. It's about sort of these globalist geopolitical narratives. You look at something like, still marketed to a Western audience, but something like Game of Thrones, for example, ignoring that terrible final season. For the most part, that series uses collective journey narrative to explore a vast range of perspectives and viewpoints and I guess power levels as well. And so the best that any writer or narrative designer can do is to include multiple perspectives and make sure every perspective is well thought out. These characters are real regardless of where they come from or what sort of group they might be connected to. We want to explore their strengths, their weaknesses, their fears, their likes and dislikes, just as much as we would explore the hero in a typical westernized hero's journey story, right? So yeah, that's really the best that we can do as narrative designers, is include that and hope that that sort of approach influences decisions outside of our control.
Right. And like when you're, I guess, sort of just to go off on a little bit of a tangent there, when you're writing for so many characters, like what are the challenges in keeping each character, honest or true to the character?
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges with it, really. Like, even after 5 years of doing this full time, I still, I will write a biography for a character and then start writing their dialogue, and then, someone will come along to edit it and they'll catch me up on something and be like, that's not what the character would do, because you say in their biography that they're like this. And so it's really, it's a process of bringing yourself back to those biographies and the world building that you've done around those characters. I may be answering potentially a future question with this, but one of the first things that I do when I come on board with a new game is to build what I would call a story Bible. And a story Bible is essentially an encyclopedia about the world of the game, or of whatever narrative media you're dealing with. And this can be anywhere between, 15 pages to 250 pages in some cases, particularly if you're dealing with like a big RPG game, right? And a story Bible, it includes a whole bunch of world building stuff. It includes geography, social systems, politics, the themes of the world, but also character biographies, and sort of really getting down into it and exploring, okay, what makes this character tick? And so when you have a document like that, you can just sort of come back to it as you're developing like the dialogue script or any other sort of narrative pieces for the game, and just sort of check it against what you've established in the Bible, and that helps to create consistency in the world and in the characters.
Cool. And like, have you ever, like, say, been in a position where you've written a character, you've developed their biography, stuff like that, and then halfway through the project something changes with this character and it just completely redefines them? Like, is there any events like that pop up? And how do you end up going to I guess retrofit these new changes once something like that happens?
Yeah, I think so. There's two parts to my answer here. I think that with any kind of writing, you are inevitably going to be surprised by decisions that your character makes. And so on that level, things will change for characters, and you kind of just go with it. I worked on a game a couple of years back now that involved a central character who was, defined as, I don't want to say cowardly, but like a little bit of a wallflower character. They kind of tended to steer clear of conflict, and they're a bit shy and nervous about themselves. And then through the course of the story, they end up becoming, an incredibly brave character, and taking big risks and all sorts of things. And that was not something that I'd necessarily written into the character himself, but something that just sort of resulted from the development of the plot and the way that that character reacts to events within the plot. And this is often the case with any sort of narrative storytelling, is you create characters and then you set up problems to throw at that character. And a story really is, how does that character respond to those issues? How do they get through it? Do they get through it? And so on that level, there's always that sort of change. I guess more on a structural level, sometimes things might change in the development process due to budget concerns or things like that. And in that case, yeah, it's a matter of trying to find the best way to retroactively change things, right? And again, this is where a story Bible comes in handy, because a story Bible is kind of a never-ending document. It's always changing and growing as you are working on that IP, and so yeah, you just kind of have to go back and fix things, and then find the easiest way, or the least what's the word, least noticeable way, at least for the player, to change things. And sometimes this is sometimes you do this well, sometimes you do it not so well. It's often dependent on the particular change, right? Sometimes a development team might be like, okay, no, we want this to happen now, and that completely flies in the face of everything else. And you know, not being the one that is making the final decisions means that you just have to kind of go with that, and find a way to cover that as best possible. So yeah, it's really a kind of luck of the draw a little bit on that level.
Well, thank you for that answer. I guess, like on the subject of world building, when do you know that you've done enough world building, and how do you know it's time to move on to writing the story and the plot?
I don't know. to be perfectly honest, you know, like world building for me is one of my favorite parts of narrative design, and it's very easy to get lost in it. I've heard floated around this idea of like people focusing too much on world building and sort of just creating all this extra content that's never going to be used, and that being not the way to go about it. I would disagree with that. I think you can never have enough content. The more content you have, even if it never shows up in the game, it still goes towards creating, for the player, a sense of vastness to the world, right? You may not use that stuff, but because you've considered that stuff, that influences the writing of the rest of the game, and makes the world feel more full and realized. So in terms of how do you know when you have enough, it often comes down to more what is the timeline that you've been given by a development team to get this done in, right? And you know, you can always come back to the story Bible and add more stuff, and you should, because the more stuff you have, the more stuff you have to use for potentially future projects within, like, especially if something's being franchised. You know, you kind of want these little throwaway lines in your story Bible that, like, I don't know, reference a war that happened 1,000 years ago, so that when it comes to developing a sequel or building a comic book spin-off or something like that, you can point to that line and be like, that's an interesting line, let's explore that further. And so in that sense, you never want to finish doing the world building. You just want to keep going at it, so that you have more to work with.
Right. So would you say like lore and world building are necessarily the same thing, or I guess what's the difference there, I suppose?
So I tend to split it into two components, what I call lore and deep lore. And so the way that I explore this is, lore is essentially just generalized world building stuff that you don't necessarily need to know to understand the plot of the game story, just stuff that will like make the world bigger and feel more alive. And then there's deep lore, and deep lore is world building components that are necessary for the player or the audience to understand, to be able to understand the plot. I often use the example of Lord of the Rings for this. The Elvish language, right, is lore. It's world building that makes the world feel more realistic, more alive, but you don't need to know however many dialects of Elvish there are to understand the plot of Lord of the Rings. On the flip side, you look at the character of Gollum, you need to know his backstory and the lore around him to kind of understand his character decisions as he interacts with the events of the plot. And so that, to me, is an example of deep lore. It's stuff that we need to know about the past of the world to understand its future. And so that's sort of how I would split those two up. But they both come under the umbrella of world building in general.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, I guess I kind of threw that in myself. It wasn't user submitted. So thank you for that. So what's your example of a good writing session? Like, do you prefer night or day? You know, how do you prefer to sit down and write? Or do you prefer to sit down at all? Or is it, you know, pacing back and forth and drawing on whiteboards kind of thing?
No whiteboards, but so I can give you the answer of what you're supposed to do, and then the answer of what I often end up doing. And the best writing experiences I've had are when I've done what you're supposed to do, which is you sit down in a room on your own, in front of your computer or your notepad or whatever you're using, and you write for 20 minutes, and then you take a 5-minute break where you walk around, you stretch, you know, move your head back and forth and all that sort of stuff. And then you sit back down for another 20 minutes, and then you take a break after those 20 minutes, and you sort of split everything up like that. Through that process, you tend to get a lot of work done. I wrote a feature-length screenplay for my master's thesis in a week doing that, just 2 hours a day, broken up into 20-minute intervals. And you know, that's how I work if I really need to get something done by a deadline. But when it's a bit more fluid and blasé, you know, you kind of tend to sit at your desk and scroll on Facebook or sit on the couch and break up your work by playing a little bit of a game in between, sort of thing. And so often I will fall into that trap a little bit, but I think at the same time, that sort of process is important as well, because it kind of gives you moments to not only back off what you're writing and relax, but also moments to explore what other people have written and sort of engage with that and learn from that. So I think both processes are important to do, but if you really want to get something done fast, break it up into the 20-minute intervals. I don't necessarily have a day or night schedule when it comes to writing. When you write for a job, you kind of have to just be ready to write whenever. That being said, I stand pretty strongly against crunch and that whole culture. So anytime I've ever been asked to crunch, I've just flat out refused. You know, I'm a freelancer. What are they going to do? Fire me? I'll just get another gig. So I would never crunch, but I, you know, will work during the day, during the morning, during the evening, just whenever best works with my schedule and the schedule of the team that I'm working with.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Moving on a little bit, I wanted to touch on some of the teaching aspect that you're doing as well. I think we're coming up on about 10 minutes left, I think. So we have a question here. He says, or they say, I'm an educator and I work with students on writing projects. I'm getting increasingly interested in narrative design and I'm working with my students on podcasts and game storylines. What potential do you see for narrative design to enter the educational space as a tool to teach writing in a modern, engaging way?
I guess the tricky thing with this is the cost of doing narrative design, as well as there is not currently really a industry formatting standard either, which, you know, this is why something like Celtx or Celtx Gem is so exciting, because you guys are attempting to like sort of establish it as industry standard, right? And so there is that factor that you have to take into play, is like, how do we make this cost effective? And so there are things like Twine, for example, or we mentioned Celtx Gem as well. And they mentioned podcasts, and podcasts are a great way to like sort of get into doing things in the creative industry without having to necessarily spend a huge amount of money. So that's exciting as well. I personally love fictional podcasts. They're such an engaging way to experience a story. So I think those are good ways to start introducing narrative design procedures into teaching, into the classroom. And I think it's if I had a bit more say in what was taught in classrooms in regards to this area, I would actually really push for teaching world building as a skill, because not only does it help strengthen your writing in general, but it helps you think about things on a more global scale, and there's a real skill to that. My own experience as a kid, right? I have a distinct memory. I think I was at I don't know what you guys would call it over there, but like we call it intermediate school. So it's kind of like when you're 11, 12 years old, sort of thing.
Okay, like a junior high.
Yeah, and so I was at school, and we had these sort of science fairs that they did every year. And I was never really big on sciencey sort of stuff, but everyone had to participate. And I, for my project, I believe I developed a world through world building processes that I knew at that age, which, granted wasn't a huge amount. And the dickheads failed me on it. And I guess the joke is on them now, because now I get paid to do that for a living, right? And so I would really love to see that sort of world building skill explored in schools, because when I was failed on that, it was quite crushing. Like, I spent all this time working on it and I put a lot of thought to it, and they were just like, nah, doesn't fit fit what we're after. And granted, maybe the science fair wasn't the best place to present it, but hey, like, not every kid is into science. Some kids are into writing, some kids are into Dungeons and Dragons or sport, right? So I think it's important to create spaces, particularly for creative kids, to explore what they can do with that creativity. I don't know what it's like over there, but here there's a big focus on sport as being kind of like the big thing to aspire to. And I would love to see over here a bit more of a focus placed on the arts as well, because you often feel left out as a creative anyway. And it's made worse when schools and governments sort of don't look for ways to include you in the conversation and allow you to grow in your skills and express what you love to do.
Or even worse, they cut funding to those programs.
Yeah, that sucks.
Yeah. So is the process of world building for video games the same or different from film? What are the differences there?
They're the same in the sense that world building is required for both, right? I've written film, I've written games obviously as well, and both require at some point a moment where you have to sit down and work out what are the rules of this world, how do things work, particularly if you're dealing with any sort of magic or supernatural elements in the story. You will have to sit down and work out, okay, how does this all work? Because that's what you're looking for. You're looking for consistency across the board. And if you don't have that, audience will notice, right? Or at least notice on a subconscious level is probably the better option. So I think, so they're both similar in that sense, but where they differ is, and I mentioned earlier, when you're writing for a game, you're building a world primarily. You are considering this setting as a place that can be explored by the player. And so, like, particularly with like fantasy RPGs or virtual reality, for example, you need to be considering, okay, how is the player going to interact with this world? What are they going to encounter first? How are they going to perceive those things? And so the major difference is that consideration. I would probably suggest that you write a story Bible regardless of whether you're working in film or games, but I would guess that a game story Bible is probably a lot more expansive, simply by the nature of how immersed and involved a player can become in that world.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. Appreciate that. I think we have time for one more question. So this is what I'm kind of fond of. How do you design separate worlds or locations, even, that will eventually intertwine to form a cohesive world, I suppose?
Okay, so I suppose you probably don't know, but are we talking about like separate worlds as in like a multiverse sort of situation, like what Marvel's hinting at, or are we just talking different areas in a world?
Either or. I guess we'll approach it from a sort of transmedia perspective, because that seems to be kind of your area of expertise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if we're talking about like transmedia worlds, for those who don't know that term, transmedia is essentially presenting narrative IP on multiple media platforms to form a larger cohesive story, right? And so, the first step of that is building a story Bible and really like nailing down the rules of the world and the different aspects and locations and characters and things like that. And then once you have that, you can start pulling from that Bible plots for different stories, at which you can place on whatever platforms you feel fit, right? But the important thing is to consider the world as the core aspect, rather than like the first story that you release, right? You don't want any story to feel more important than the other. Each should feel equal contributions to the world, which is why like the Marvel cinematic universe works so well, for example, is every film in that series feels more or less like its own standalone piece, but it forms the pattern of a larger world, right? And so that's really how you have to sort of consider it. And personally, the way that I have done that is initially by dropping little one-liners and references to other things in a text, and then doing the same thing with the next text and the same thing with the next text, right? So that players or audience members start to like notice these reoccurring motifs and going, like this is connected to this. Another really cool way of building interactivity into transmedia worlds, and something that I pulled from Software's process with Dark Souls and Bloodborne, is creating intentional plot holes in your world. And I don't mean plot holes in the sense of like inconsistencies or contradictions, but areas to do with the plot or with the world that are not fully formulated, or at least not fully formulated for the public to see.
Mm-hmm.
And what this tends to create for players is intrigue, and a desire to find out more and to suggest their own ideas and create their own versions of events. And this kind of creates a sense of like co-authorship with the audience, or with the players, particularly if you as the writer are listening into this work and then start introducing these ideas into future iterations of the IP or of the game, so that players do have like that sort of personal connection, like I helped create this. I think maybe, or maybe it was someone else, but like, you know, you feel recognized as a player, as an audience member, when creatives listen and respond through the text.
Exactly. Perfect. And I guess to just cap it off on the subject of transmedia world building, you know, can we expect any, you know, say fragrances to go along with games that you end up building, kind of thing? Like, is that something you've actually thought of?
I can't talk too much about it.
Say no more.
But we definitely, you know, what we're building with this business is more than just a fragrance company. We have characters, we have a whole story bible of lore and deep lore about the world that these fragrances come from. And you know, potentially in the future, maybe we will see some form of an interactive experience associated with the brand. But I mean, at the moment, probably the closest connection that we have within that right now is a few of the fragrances are inspired by games that not that I've worked on, but ones that I've played and enjoyed and felt had really good narrative design to it. This may not necessarily be known to customers when they purchase it, but it is going on behind the scenes as we're sort of creating them.
That's so much fun. Can you tell us any of the games that have inspired you? Or the sense, I should say.
So we have one that that is quite heavily influenced by Ghost of Tsushima, and then there is another one that influenced by a mix of different medias, but Bloodborne and just kind of like Lovecraftian horror in general, which has been interesting, trying to figure out, okay, how do we create a perfume that is inspired by horror without it smelling horrible? So that's been fun to navigate.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think that just about does it for our user submitted questions, or our audience submitted questions, I should say. I'm going to turn this back to Dara again to clue up, and thank you for your time.
No worries.
Thank you again, Nick, for joining us, especially so early in the morning and from halfway around the world. We really appreciate it. We hope everyone you know, took a lot away from this webinar. I know that I did, and I really enjoyed the discussions that we had here. And thank you, everyone who attended.